About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go, let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free. Let's go, let's be
Improved by a whole grade. I've improved. Improved.
By a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
My teacher isn't just Mr. Maddock. It's a whole teaching team made up of James, Mike and Marta.
My classroom's all about doing and applying. My days standing at the front of the classroom with a PowerPoint are long gone.
I master every concept by learning at my own pace.
I spend 100% of my class time interacting and supporting individual students.
I move on only when the moment is right for me, not the whole class.
I know what each and every student is mastering and struggling on at every moment.
I know exactly what I need to learn next, and I can go back and review material at any time.
I spend my teaching time supporting and inspiring, not planning, delivering and marking.
I can learn from anywhere at any time.
I can switch off when school closes, knowing they are learning from the best.
My teacher has my homework marked before I get to class.
I set every piece of homework at the start of the year.
I'm 2 weeks ahead of my expected progress.
I can track everyone's progress with a swipe of a finger.
I can track my own progress and set my own targets.
I now have time to focus on developing the skills of every learner in my classroom.
I know exactly what it means to explain, evaluate and analyse, and I'm not afraid of any exam.
My lessons are now far more about the skills and the application, not just the content itself.
I've completely remodeled what it means to be a teacher in my classroom.
Good afternoon, one and all. It is Thursday, the 10th of May 2018. It's 4 p.m. and we are live, and I haven't got my chair in the position I wanted it to be in. My name's James Sims. Thank you for joining us. It's really appreciated. We are going through some skill acquisition for GCSE PE this afternoon. I'm hoping this is going to be a really functional and useful show for all of you. With us in the studio is Marta.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi. And Mike is also with us, although he's not here in the studio. He's working from home today and he is doing the social media side of things. A couple of reminders before we get straight into this. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's super important you do that. Please don't avoid that. Please do it. It makes a massive difference to us to be able to continue to do this, as we've said on numerous occasions. So therefore, we do genuinely want you to do that. It costs you nothing. And it makes quite a big difference for us. Secondly, you should have notes pages in front of you. If you're in a classroom with your teacher at the moment, your teacher is very likely to have given you the notes. If you don't have them, either in the live show, you're going to have to rush to do this, or if you're if you've taken this on demand afterwards, the notes are just in the description just below. Okay, so you can download them and print them from there. If you need to scramble and do that now, it's worth doing that. You can pause the live stream, by the way. We have what's called DVR enabled, which means you can pause and drag back the live stream, but unfortunately you can't drag forward. Why? Because it's live and forward hasn't happened yet, or future hasn't happened yet. So that's enabled for you, so you can do that if you need to, especially when we do things like the answer demonstrations. Thirdly, we want you to interact with us during the show, please. So 2 ways to do that. First of all is with the interactive questions, which I think Martha's going to show you now. You're going to tell us about Martha, or shall I tell her?
Sure, yes. It's just that the microphone was a bit far away.
Careful with that.
Don't worry. Right, so you need to go to theeverlearner.com, click on News. Once on News, you need to go to Interactive Questions, click on here, and then you've got the GCSE PE here, Skill Acquisition.
Session 5, yeah.
Good. Click here, and here is today's question. Don't forget to click on Submit once you've completed your answers.
Okay, good stuff. So really do those. We're looking forward to reading those. We enjoy receiving those. So please send them in. Teachers, get your whole classes to submit them perhaps as well. It's a nice activity to do between now and the exam, and you can get some feedback on your answers from us. Secondly, we do want you as well to send us some photos in of what you're doing in the little revision breaks that we do during the show today. So if you have something kind of quirky or interesting that you're doing between the different sessions, between the different segments that we do want to see those. Please do get permission from anybody that's going to be in the photo, that you can actually take that photo and send it to us. We can only show photos, and we'll show all of them that we feel confident are appropriate for the stream. So do that. Final thing for me is you will have a couple of little volume changes because we switch between microphones during the show, from when we go from this fella here to the canvas-based microphone, which is on my chest. Okay, so you might get some changes in volume. You might need to change the volume as we go. But all that being said, Marta, I think we're nice and smooth and ready to go. Looking forward to questions from the guys after we've gone through the session. I've got my digital pen ready. I'm good to go when you are ready, Marta. Yep. Good.
Okay, so let's do a little bit of guidance. And my primary aim here is to really get some high quality learning into this topic area, and then to look at what is quite a tricky question, applying this knowledge to sort of genuine exam situations. So let's see if we can achieve that. When we talk about guidance, first of all, we're talking about something, a type of information that causes a technical improvement. So, of course, if you think about any of our athlete profiles, whether it's Kate or whether it's Joe or whatever, cause a technical improvement, we would use guidance because we want to improve their technique. It's a skill-based development. Guidance, I suppose, can be applied to concepts of fitness, but really what we're talking about here is centrally focused on the idea of technical performance within one's application, one's running technique or one's serving technique, in tennis we'll look at a bit later on. So make sure you get that nice and clear. We're guiding people towards the correct way of doing something. Now, we have 4 primary methods that we want to discuss here. Let me just actually zoom this in a little bit further so we can see everything on the one page. I need to make that a bit bigger in a second. So we've got our 4 methodologies of guidance here, and I'm going to start with this visual aspect over here. Okay, and what I want to kind of get to straight away is that the first thing we want to understand by visual guidance is very frequently we are talking about a concept of demonstrations. So you guys will be really familiar with this because you will have been in PE lessons, coaching sessions where demonstration is a key facet of the learning experience. Now I want to highlight to you that it's important that we get real clarity through that demonstration. Exactly what is it that we're looking to demonstrate, and therefore what is it that we're looking for the learner to retain. We're looking for the quality of the demonstration. If the demonstration is of something wobbly or shaky or poor quality, then of course it's going to be much less effective at getting the right technique. And we've got this notion of similarity. Okay, and what do we mean by that is that if a demonstration is being performed by individuals who the observers feel identified with or feel that they're similar to them, a classic would be similar age, same gender, similar or just above skill level. This sort of notion of similarity helps a lot with the retention of information and the motivation of performers. Don't forget that with visual guidance, we can use something like video guidance, which has an O, not an A on the end, James, obviously. So we've got visual guidance, which is performed in a recorded sense. Now, again, if we don't have a high quality demonstration or demonstrator, then of course that video aspect can be really, really useful. And by video, obviously in the modern world, we're not talking about spooled tapes. We're talking about MP4s, which are continuously available on handheld devices. This kind of thing becomes very practical. Now, other points about visual is that we are probably talking about notions of performance analysis. Okay, performance analysis, and let me add the word software in there. Okay, it may well be that if we're working with a netball player, say, who's practicing his or her shooting as a GA or a GS, then it's very likely that we're going to take video of that performer and either overlay it on model technique or compare it next to side-by-side model technique. And performance analysis software allows us to do that, and it's an excellent form of visual guidance. Let me actually write the word comparison in there. It allows a form of comparison. Now, really important point here, I encourage you to get it into all of your answers. All of what I've just talked about help the athlete to create a mental picture, or in the athlete it creates a mental picture. So first of all, you might want to establish what kind of learners might need to do that. And I guess the answer that would come out is that novice learners, sometimes what we call cognitive stage learners, but let's stick with the idea of novice or beginner learners, are very likely to benefit most from this methodology. So that's where we're going with this. Now, I want to address that there are some positives and negatives here. So on the positive side for visual guidance, because we always want to be able to evaluate, this is relatively cheap. Okay, so it's relatively cheap. It's available if there's a coach available. We can do demonstrations with large numbers, so we can get a lot of information to people quickly. And another positive on here, we've got that it's repeatable. Okay, so it's not just a one-off thing, it's a repeatable, potentially at least, action. But we do have some negatives, and what are they? Let me just scoot down here. We do have some negatives. What are those negatives? Well, the first one is demo quality. Now, what if the demonstration is not high enough quality? I remember as in the early days of my PE teaching career, when I never really played basketball in my life, and I was trying to demonstrate basketball skills, it was probably not as good as my other areas that I was teaching. So demo quality does become an issue. Can video, for example, address that possibility? And the other point, and I'd really get you to reflect on this, is that demonstrations need. Let me try this again. We've got the need for verbal guidance alongside. So verbal guidance, which is going to come here, visual guidance needs verbal guidance in combination. So one of the classic terms I would encourage you to get into your answers when you're answering about more than one guidance type is that a combination of guidance types is positive and useful. Let's have a look now at verbal guidance. I'll write this in sort of black because the yellow is not going to show up very well on the white. So here, again, let me write that term, often used in combination. And we already know one of those combinations, so that's useful. Often used in combination. Nice. We could be talking here, a classic example is something like coaching points. Okay, a coaching points, let me think about it. In table tennis, for example, we're looking at a backhand push shot. I would say something like feet must be shoulder width apart and the non-hitting arm must be flexed at 90 degrees and above the height of the table. Okay, those would be classic examples of coaching points to try and elicit the correct technique out of the performer. But of course, it helps if we also demonstrate that too, right? So we often use those things in combination. We also say with verbal guidance, it's what we call a form of feedback. Okay, it's a form of feedback. Okay, and feedback in this sense, it's what we would call extrinsic feedback. Okay, so it's feedback which comes from outside of the individual. We'll look at internal feedback or intrinsic feedback in in a moment. Now, other examples of verbal guidance, we could be talking about peer feedback. And what we mean by that, and anyone who's sort of studied teaching or coaching styles, you might know this is the reciprocal style. Peer feedback is where the coach or the teacher or the trainer equips the performers to coach one another. And therefore, it might be because the players are given coaching cards, for example, and they observe one another's performance and they feed back on one another's performance based on that information. So, of course, it increases the amount of verbal guidance which is available, and it means that performers are not waiting for the coach, who very often there's only one of them, to come and look at their performance and offer feedback. So it's a nice way of doing it. And the other real nice example of this, and I would suggest to you this is a really important one, is Q&A sessions. Okay, Q&A is a form of verbal guidance. Okay, now I'm going to give you a quick example of this that I actually experienced in the last couple of days. So on a Saturday afternoon, coaching men's football on a Saturday afternoon, we were playing one of our last games of the season, and we came in at half time and we were 2-0 up in an away game. And basically the first half had gone in a way that was, we were under pressure the whole of the first half, not having a lot of possession, this kind of thing, and we scored 2 breakaway goals. So rather than bringing the team in and telling them, we want you to A, B, so we want you to sit deep, we want you to defend for long periods, we want you to want you to break rapidly, develop quickly with the pace that we've got out wide. Rather than saying all of these things, we asked the players simple questions. Okay, when did we make chances in that first half? And the players said to us, well, it's when we were on the break. How many high-quality chances did our opponents make when they had possession of the ball? Not too many. So what's the best way of us to play in the second half? Well, we should sit deep and we should hit them on the break. And we did that and we came out with a good performance. But that doesn't matter. But you take my point. Rather than telling performers what they have to do, eliciting the response perhaps makes it more meaningful for the performers in a question and answer session. And they're very likely to come up with the right answers. I'm banging on. Positives. Again, verbal guidance is what we would describe as cheap. It's available. That's very positive. It's always available. Okay, so it's a very common experience within a practice scenario, of course. But there are some negatives. It has no picture. Okay, so it has no visual aspect to it unless we combine it. And again, we've got the possibility of overloading the performer. And I don't mean this is a positive principle of training. I mean overloading in the sense that if we give too many coaching points, for example, if we give 10 coaching points to a novice learner, they're not going to retain that information. So we have to chunk it up and keep it nice and simple. Let's look at manual guidance. Go up to the top here. Let's have a look at manual guidance. Okay, let's have a look at manual guidance. Let me use my green for this one. So with manual guidance, we are talking about physically guiding a performer, to physically guide a performer. So in other words, the coach will actually put their hands on the performer and they will do what we call physical manipulation, which sounds very threatening somehow, but we don't mean it like that, of course. What we mean here is that, a coach might guide the tennis player's arm into the correct angle of flexion at the elbow in preparation for their serve. So they might actually guide that position without sort of straining a joint. They might guide that position. Or a swimming coach might physically manipulate a performer's legs because they want them to get the feel of the correct breaststroke leg kick technique. Okay, so those would be classic examples. Now, interesting point here, unlike many of the other methodologies, this happens during practice. So it's not something where we break up practice and we do this separately. It's happening during the practice phase. So it's happening during it, which is kind of interesting because that, of course, develops what we'd call the feeling of the skill. Okay, sometimes we call that kinesthetic awareness, but it's the feeling of the skill. And importantly, it's the feeling of the correct skill. Now, we've said already, this is what we'd call a hands-on approach. And we'd also describe this as a form of intrinsic feedback. Okay, intrinsic feedback. So the performer develops this. That's feedback there, believe it or not. They develop this feeling of the skill. And of course, that's very positive for the performer. So let's have a look at the strengths and the weaknesses that kind of used up my colours a little bit here. But on the positive side, we get that feeling, which is good, that kinesthetic feeling. We also get the example that this is a memorable model of learning something. It's something that we do tend to learn because we develop that feeling as well as the instruction. On the negative side, it's what we call hands-on, and of course there's some safety and protection issues around that, but I'm not going to go down that route. And the other point, which is more on the technical side, is that the performer is not controlling the performance. Okay, so the performer is not controlling the performance. The guide, the coach is. Now, on the mechanical guidance side, let's finish off with this one before we get on to our question. This is where we use what we call equipment or an aid. Okay, so we use some kind of equipment to guide the performer into the right movement pattern. So a great example would be a harness. So if a gymnast or a trampolinist was practicing a back somersault for the first time, we might use a harness around their hips to actually aid them through the rotation to prevent things like danger and landing on one's head. Okay, so that can be really helpful. Another classic example of this would be something like a bowling machine in cricket, where the machine, and we find the same things in table tennis for serving the ball up, where the machine actually serves the ball up to the performer. Now, we can describe these in some cases at least as high-tech methods, but they can also be very simple. Let's look at the positives. It helps to develop safety. Secondly, it provides consistency to the skill. So we actually get to practice the skill rather than, waiting for a bowler to deliver the ball in the right place, for example. But on the negative side, we have, that's an 8, a lack of realism. Okay, so it doesn't seem to be it's not exactly like the real situation, such as performing a somersault or receiving a ball from a proper bowler, and it can lead to reliance or over-reliance by the performer. So it can be a weakness in that sense that the performer can end up reliant on this model. Now, what we want to do with all that information is we want to take it down and have a look at this question here. Now, the first thing I want to say to you is that this is a tough question, all right? In one sense, the content we're going to include is relatively straightforward because it's all the stuff about guidance we've just discussed. The problem with this question, if we go through it together, Joe is being coached on the tennis serving action. Yeah, we can see that. That makes sense. Discuss the ways in which Joe's coach might guide him to the correct technique. So first issue with this question is it doesn't actually say the word guidance. Okay, so first of all, is this question about guidance? You may find sometimes in your exam questions that the exam questions are worded in a way that doesn't directly point exactly at your subject content. Here we get this kind of term, how Joe's coach might guide him. And of course, if we're guiding, we're using guidance. I mean, it's obvious, but we need to understand that. Secondly, the command to discuss, as we've said in numerous other recordings and live shows so far, we've got a situation here where discuss does not tell you exactly what you're looking to do. Discuss literally means talk about main points. Okay, talk about main points. But the issue we have is that behind a discuss question is usually one of these skills. It's normally an evaluate, which we could do here. We've got the strengths and weaknesses of each of our methodologies, so we could evaluate each one. It asks you to analyze sometimes. To analyze means to break it down into parts and explain it. Sometimes it asks us to compare. When it asks us to compare, it usually says something like, discuss the similarities and differences of X and Y. Okay, so perhaps we're not doing a compare here. And so what have we got in our question here? Well, in my opinion, we've got an analyze question. So remember what analyze is. It's to break down and it's to explain it. Now, if you are on an exam board who are convincing you that to analyze something means that you give strengths and weaknesses, while I utterly disagree with that in any kind of linguistic sense, you do need to do that. Okay, so discuss that with your teacher. If your exam board, and there is at least one out there at the GCSE PE level, if they consider analyze to be the same as evaluate, then of course what you're going to do is you're going to follow that model, and what you're going to do is you're going to perform an evaluation. You're going to be talking about mechanical guidance negative. It relates to over-reliance. And other positives and negatives of the other methods. But what we're going to do is we're going to break this down and explain it, because we're going to consider this to be an analyze response. So how would we start that? Well, by the way, I'm using colour, just so you know here, The black is just text. So it's just, I don't know, what would you call it, like filler. The orange is what we'd call skill language. So, you know, I'm going to be breaking this down and explaining it. So any kind of breaking down and explaining language. And green is key terms, or if you like, correct answer. Okay, so that's how I've broken this down. So let's go through it. And you are going to need to spend longer on this than I am going to as I demonstrate this now live. Joe's coach should use a combination of visual, verbal, manual and mechanical guidance. So I've already made my first point, which is about the combination. So I'm going to get credit for that. Would I get a circle and a tick for each of visual, verbal, manual and mechanical? Well, I've only named them there. You can call it identifying. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But what I now want to do is I want to analyze. I want to break it down and explain it. So what's the first one I'm going to break down into? Firstly, look at that key language. I'm clearly analysing. I'm breaking this down into parts. Firstly, visual guidance could be achieved through, there's our classic explaining language. Remember, break down and explain. Achieved through a high quality, clear demonstration of the served by, classic explaining language, the coach or another performer. Okay, this means, classic explaining language, Joe would create a mental picture of the skill. This can be backed up with the use of video demonstration or even performance analysis software, allowing Joe to compare his performance. So all I've done there is I've taken my visual guidance and I've got my key knowledge down in an explanatory structure. So I've said through, by, this means I'm explaining. And I've got some really great content that's gone into my answer. And that is it. That's as hard as it needs to be. Next one. Let's just move down here. Secondly, so again, I'm analysing, I'm breaking it down. Joe's coach will use verbal guidance by, explain language, providing coaching points as a form of extrinsic feedback. An example would be, and I'm giving an example here, Joe, your front foot should point to the opposite net post. Will I get some credit for giving my example? The coach could also use question and answer sessions and even peer feedback. Okay, verbal guidance works by providing high quality linguistic information. I actually meant to write that earlier, I didn't. High quality linguistic information to Joe. Okay, so again, I've broken it down into my verbal bit, my verbal chunk, my verbal breakdown in the analysis, and I'm explaining it. I'm using by, I'm using through, I'm using that kind of language. Thirdly, Joe's coach might use manual guidance by, explain language, physically manipulating him into the correct position. This means Joe would experience the feeling of the correct skill through this hands-on approach. So I'm using key language within my answer here. Now again, I could give an example here. Perhaps I write what I said before. The coach ensures that that Joe has less than a 45-degree angle at the flexed elbow in the preparation phase of the service action by physically manipulating the arm into that position and dragging the racket further down towards the lower back. Okay, so I could use that sort of coaching point. And of course, what I'm going to do finally is I'm going to do fourthly and write all about mechanical guidance. So again here, with mechanical guidance, we could be using all kinds of things. We could be using targets. We could be using hoops. We could be using elastics around Joe's shoulders to make sure that he gets the right rotation around his spine as he goes to hit the serve. We could be talking about that kind of mechanical guidance. I just kind of ran out of space here, so I'll allow you to do that last one itself. Now, can you guys just draw out from that a couple of key things? One is I've clearly analysed because I've broken it down and I've explained it. Let me give that health warning again. If your exam board, for some reason, argue that analysing is the same as evaluating, you must put into your answer your strengths and your weaknesses. Okay, where have I gone? Your strengths and your weaknesses. You must put those in. Okay, your positives and negatives, because they are going to be required. Speak to your teacher if you're unsure about that. And of course, if this question was evaluate the ways, you would automatically put that information in because you're creating an evaluation. But for us, we deem this to be an analyze question, so we broke it down and we explained it.
Okay, good. Where are we, Marta? Tell me.
We're here. Is my phone? Yeah, not phone, microphone. Right, a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one. The first one's got to do with modern technology. Is the information...
Marta, just make sure you're speaking to the microphone. Cause
okay.
Yeah.
I'm a bit far away. Okay. Is the information that you get from something like an Apple Watch a type of guidance? And if so, what type of guidance is it?
Well, you could potentially post that into a couple of different categories. First of all, when you talk about that, I tend to consider that a form of feedback, personally. So I would tend to think that more as a form of feedback. We're going to cover feedback in the next session on, let me remind myself, on Monday. So I would think of it much more as a form of feedback. Now, is it a form of guidance? Yes, I suppose it is. I mean, the only thing that kind of makes me think away from guidance is that, as the very first thing I said there, guidance really is about technical improvement of technique improvement. And for me, that the Apple Watch information, whether it's the pace you're running out or your heart rate, whatever, it's information about how your performance is happening. So it's more like an extrinsic. Some of you might even be able to refer to it as a concurrent type of feedback. Some of you don't talk about concurrent feedback, but so I would think about it more in that way. If we were going to force it into the guidance category, what kind of guidance would it be? Well, it touches on the mechanical, because it's an aid, it's a device. Depending on how it's presented to you, it's probably linguistic, so therefore it may well be a form of verbal guidance. Instructions into your earphone, for example, would be kind of a form of verbal guidance. And I guess potentially, I don't know all apps, but I'm sure there's certain apps that can provide you a visual stimulus, either a video or a representation of a movement. Then of course that would be visual. So, but for me, I would tend to think more of Apple Watch as a form of feedback.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and about intrinsic feedback.
Intrinsic feedback?
Intrinsic, yeah.
Okay, talking about feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the question. So when should you start relying on intrinsic feedback?
Well, you should definitely start relying on it next Monday when we do the session on that, because we're going to go over that in detail. But intrinsic feedback, if we think of it like as a feeling of how we perform something correctly or incorrectly, that is going to become much more important once we get out of that kind of the novice stage development and growth out of learning a particular skill. So the early stage of learning something new, we tend not to have the intrinsic feeling of that being a correct thing or not. So that tends to become more important later. Now, where that intrinsic feedback helps here is that, of course, if we use something like manual or mechanical guidance, those methodologies can lead to the correct feeling of the skill over and above just being described the correct skill or witnessing or a visual image of the correct skill. So it can be useful in that context. But generally speaking, that feeling of correctness comes in the later stages, which is why manual and mechanical guidance are useful, because you can get the correct feeling of the correct skill earlier on in the learning cycle. So yeah, so at that point.
Mm-hmm. And is there any type of guidance that is more important than the others?
Again, I would answer that to say that depends on the stage of learning that the learner is at. So one of the things we can say really critically is that visual guidance is hyper important for an early stage learner. Sometimes we use the term a cognitive stage learner or a novice, a beginner. Okay, so for the beginner, the importance of creating the mental picture in the mind is super important. So therefore, we would argue that visual guidance is particularly important for the early stage learner. You then got to look at the timing of things like mechanical guidance. I would suggest that mechanical guidance is better than other forms of guidance when there's danger. For example, you're doing your first back somersault on a trampoline, use a harness or land on a crash mat. That kind of mechanical guidance is going to be really important at that point and more important than the other kinds. So it depends on the circumstances in that way. When would verbal guidance, again, it's very important when you're looking at the detail of things. Okay, so if you're looking to get the detail of something, verbal guidance is particularly important to that. Manual guidance tends to get used mostly for error correction. Okay, so when something has gone wrong, the table tennis player is hitting the wrong technique or something like that, then we're going to use some kind of manual guidance to correct that error. So I would argue that manual guidance is particularly important for error correction after error detection has taken place. So I guess it just depends on the specific circumstances. So without meaning to, the key is to combine them all where possible. But for early stage learners, novice learners, visual. When there's danger, we would have real importance on mechanical. Where there is error, we would look at particularly important, we'd look at manual. And where we're looking at getting into the deeper details of performance, then the verbal can often be particularly important at that time. But I don't want to really lean on one over the others, because I think they are all important and they should be combined. And you should write they should be combined in your answers too. Yeah.
Brilliant.
So there we go. Thank you. Any other questions?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay.
But of course, I would encourage everyone to send questions if they've got any.
Am I right in thinking you have one image you would like to show, Marta?
I do have one image. Give me 1 second. I thought we may do that afterwards, so that's why I had sort of, but I can improvise. Maybe not. Right.
Marta, please make sure you're speaking to the microphone, because you're cutting out quite a bit.
Okay. So here we've got this answer sent by Bishop Luther School. It was sent back on the 3rd of May.
Just into the microphone.
Yeah, it was sent back on the 3rd of May. We just haven't had a session since. And it's an answer. I don't know what student it's written by, but it was sent by Mr. Godfrey from the PE department. So, it looks very good. And it looks like the student has put a lot of sort of energy into answering that question. You can see by the engravings at the back of the page.
There's some real tension in that writing. That is a very firm pressure that students had on that bit of paper. But that's great. We really appreciate receiving those answers. So please do send them in. Bishop Luffer, once again, we offer a massive thank you to you guys for submitting some interaction with us. So I think we one more now, Marta, or you want to do one, or should we do one more at the end?
I'll do it.
Okay, we'll do that at the end. So we have a couple more we're going to show you. So let's make a move from here. We'll go straight on to the next session, where we're going to have a look at goal setting.
So we're going to address the idea of goal setting. And my main priority with goal setting is I want you guys to have a really good understanding of SMART targets. Just let me tell you that if you're on the GCSE course, you need to have a really good example of smarter targets. You have this ER on the end for exciting and recorded. Nobody else does. In fact, while I'm thinking about that, let me actually put in place for you something that I think you might find useful. Each of you, basically, depending on the exam board you're on, whether you're here on AQA or whether you're here on IGCSE or anything in between, you have slightly different keywords which make up this acronym of SMART or smarter. All right, so I'm going to talk about all of them here, but obviously for you guys, you just need to make sure that you're picking out the one that is relevant for you. So make sure that you know whether you're an AQA, if you're studying on AQA or EdXL, and so on and so on. So I'm going to cover all of these, and I'll probably keep reference checking back to make sure everyone's got it nice and clear, but it's useful for you just to clarify that situation, because if you are on AQA and you've got this term here of accepted, and in a moment I talk about the concept of agreed, or I talk about the concept of achievable, you just need to make sure that you can decipher it for your own uses. Now, usefully and positively, the first of these is that targets must be specific. Okay, now, when we're talking about specific target, why have I done that? When we're talking about specific targets, we are talking about making targets relatable to certain specific criteria. So classic examples would be things that we make our targets related to an energy system. So are we targeting aerobic or anaerobic development? We target our training, or sorry, I should say, we focus our targets on the component of fitness. So we're going to talk about Kate in a moment, who's a triathlete. So obviously we're going to be particularly interested in cardiovascular fitness, or what you might refer to as cardiovascular endurance. Okay, so we might focus our targets on the component of fitness. It can be on a body area. Okay, so we can specifically focus on something like strength of the shoulders, if we're a thrower, for example. So it could be related to a body area, and it can also be related to what we might refer to as individual differences. Okay, and what I mean by that is that, if we are working with, let's stick with the thrower theme. Let's say we're working with shot putters. Well, we're probably going to target our training quite differently if we're working with a group of 25-year-old shot putters compared to a group of 13-year-old shot putters. Okay, we may have to cater our targets to the audience with whom we are working, or indeed, if we're setting our own targets, who we are as an individual. So we can make targets specific in that way. So later on, we're going to talk about Kate as a triathlete. With her, it's fairly obvious that she's going to work on, for example, she's going to make her targets specific to the aerobic system, and she's going to focus her targets on CV endurance. I know some of you call it CV fitness, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Okay, so CV endurance. So this would be a classic example of how to make a target specific. Now the M again is consistent. We are talking about targets being measurable. Now, measurable means that success within the target is objective. Okay, so it gives a particular measurement or performance indicator in something like a fitness test scores. A classic example, fitness test scores. Or as I just said a moment ago, performance indicators. Okay, performance indicators. So we may take a key or central feature of, let's choose a different example. Let's choose tennis. We may take a different example of a tennis player, and we may look at the key performance indicators that relate to that performance success. So if we were to take the serve, for example, we looked at it a bit earlier on, we might take the percentage of first serve success, and we might combine that with the speed of the first and the second serve, and use those as performance indicators to make our targets measurable over a particular time scale. And I am going to also mention here time scales, even though we're going to talk about times elsewhere, because time scales, of course, allow us to make training goals measurable by their nature. We're going to improve by so-and-so percentage in so-and-so test in 6 weeks would be a classic example, even though we're going to talk about time later. Now, on fitness tests, just a piece of guidance I would give. Different books say different things on this, but a classic example is saying something like 5% improvement on a fitness test score. Okay? So that can be on any fitness test score. If we're talking about Kate and her triathlon again, we might be looking for a 5% improvement on her multi-stage fitness test score over a 6-week continuous training program. Okay, so we can use that as a measurable entity within our targets. Now, this is where it gets a little bit weird. Okay, so on the A, you'll notice up here we've got accepted, we've got, where are we? Achievable, we've got agreed, and we've got agreed. Now, first things first, first of all, I'm going to write this in black because the yellow won't work. But for me, when I think about agreed and accepted, I think about them as the same principle. Okay, and what we're saying here is we agree or we accept these goals in combination with people. Okay, so we set the goals in association with coach or trainer. Okay, and what we mean by that is that the individual performer is, whatever goals are set, let's take that 5% multi-stage fitness test improvement over 6 weeks, that should be agreed not just by the performer setting it for themselves or the coach setting it for the performer, but between the coach and the performer. It has to be that way, okay? Now, we also want to have a look at the idea of achievable. Achievable. Hang on, do you have a... Goodness me, James, I put an... Let's spell it correctly, shall we? Achievable. Okay, so with achievable, what we want the target here to be, we want it to be challenging, but not impossible. Okay, so a nice way of picturing it is you want the target to be just at the fingertips reach of the performer. They can just get there, but it's achievable. It's not impossible. It's not some pie in the sky destination that is never going to be arrived at. We're setting a target which the performer can, if they push themselves, get to. In other words, it's achievable. It's achievable in that context. And that's what we want, challenging but not impossible. That's why if we come back to this 5% figure, if we said, right, Kate, we want a 25% increase in your multi-stage fitness, well, it's not going to be achieved. If we said a 1% improvement, well, she could probably do that the next day by trying a bit harder. Okay, so we want that 5% feels like the right area, the right zone for a 6-week training program for someone who's already at a good level of fitness. Now, we move on to our R's. And again, you'll notice here that we've got realistic, we've got realistic, we've got recorded, we've got realistic, and we've got realistic, even though we've got another R here. So let's assume it's realistic to begin with, and I'll mention recorded for you in a second. So with realistic, it's very similar to the concept of achievable. In fact, in my opinion, these ones that have got achievable and realistic within the same acronym, I don't really think it's very helpful. So by realistic, we mean it's achievable. We can say that within time frame, as a really loud airplane seems to be going past, within the time frame, this should be very, very possible to achieve whatever that target is. That's what we mean by realistic. Okay, so we've got to also think that realistic leads to a notion of motivation. You know, the individual performer or the group of performers feel identified and implicated in the challenge of achieving the goal because it can be achieved. If you set something that can be achieved and the performer doesn't achieve it, of course it kind of feels difficult because why was that? Why wasn't it achieved? So realistic is important. Now, for those of you, where were we on recorded? Where's the recorded one? So OCR, you guys in a second, just bear in mind that I'm going to talk about recorded just here, so you can pick it up just there with me, okay? Now, the other example of our T, we've got timed or time phased or what we call time bound. Okay, this is all the same point. Just make sure that on your exam board you're using the correct term. AQA, you're going to use time bound. EdXL, you're going to use time bound. OCR, you're going to use timed. Educast WGAC, you're going to use time phased, and IGCSE, you're going to use time phased. Just make sure you're using the right term for your particular specification. But the key thing here is that we have a deadline. Okay, we have a deadline. Now that deadline can be what we'd call medium term. That would be something like 6 weeks. But we will have more macro goals that will be long term, and it could be something like 18 weeks. Okay, so we're going to have a situation here where we have a time commitment to make the goal achieved. Okay, we commit to that goal and the performer or the performers get to that goal within that time phasing. And of course, it's very good for developing focus and motivation. Now, the only thing I'd say that would sort of change this is that sometimes within training things go wrong, things change. Someone has a muscle strain and can't train for a week. You sometimes have to sort of move the time phasing to suit the particular scenario or the individual athlete. That's why we come back to that point of specific targets. So it's not that you set a target in stone, no matter what, you don't shift from it. No, sometimes you do have to shift from it, and it's useful to know that. Now, for you IGCSE cats only, you've also got an ER. So E means exciting. Okay, so we want the goals to be exciting. I like to use the term compelling. Okay, compelling goals. And of course, what this leads to is a feeling of motivation. Okay, the performer wants to achieve that thing. I think it goes hand in hand with that achievable, realistic point. It has to be possible. And finally, we've got our recorded point. Okay, recorded. Now, with recorded, we could be thinking, and let me remind myself, recorded was both relevant for IGCSE BODs, but we've also got recorded, which is important for you OCR dudes in there, okay? So, recorded. We've got things like a training diary. We've got things like a wall chart. We've got things like record keeping. You know, if you think of something like resistance training, weight training, it may well be that the athlete keeps a record of every single rep and every single resistance and every single set that they take, so they can see clearly exactly what amount of work has been done and what hasn't. Now, recorded is an important thing because, of course, those records are what are going to allow the individual and the trainer to be informed going forward to reset targets again in the future. So that recording is an important point as well. Okay, so there's our SMARTER principle. Lots of information there. Let's have a look at a question here. I'll make this slightly bigger. Hang on a second. Never like doing this sort of live on where you guys are watching in case I screw it up somehow. So practice questions. What have we got here? We've got using specific examples, explain how Kate could use the SMART method to establish compelling goals. So I'm looking at explaining how. We already know that if we're explaining how, we're using language like through, we're using language like by. So-and-so happens by, so-and-so is the case through the process of. That is how we explain how something happens. And down here, look, we've got a 6-mark question, okay? So let's have a little go at this. Let's start it off. What have we got to begin with? Again, same structure. We've got black is just text. We've got orange, which is the skill language. It's going to be things like through and by, because I'm explaining how, so it's going to be like that. And the green is key terms. Now, obviously, you're not going to write in black, orange, and green in your exam because you're going to write in black. But in terms of this practice methodology, it's quite useful to do it this way. Let's have a little look. Kate could do this by making goals specific. Okay, so there's that point, but I've got to give more details to get my mark. To her aerobic energy system, the most important component of fitness, CV endurance. Okay, now maybe I'm going to get a sub-max there. Okay, I can't get more than 2 marks for any particular letter of the acronym. It is likely that this will involve continuous training, so this would probably get me a mark as well, but I've got my submax to improve these areas. So what we're saying here is that we're using continuous training to work on CV endurance as an aerobic athlete. We're making training specific, or we're making goals specific. Next series of points. To improve these areas, Kate must make goals measurable. Okay, how does she do that? By relating targets to fitness test scores and performance indicators such as split times. Okay, so I'm literally saying we're going to measure split times as a performance indicator, and we're going to make our goals associated to those, such as we want to improve our transition times between the swim and the bike and the run. We want to improve those by 5%. Okay, that would be a good example of making things measurable. Measurement allows Kate to be very focused on the exact variables that are planned for. Okay, so we could potentially get some credit for that, but we've got our submax. Let's keep having a look. What have we got next? Nice. Kate must use targets that are agreed. So I've used agreed, not achievable here. If you're an achievable, you must write achievable, okay? They are agreed. Okay, so there's our key language. By setting them in association with the coach, okay? We get a mark for that one. And I've got here, or other performers. If you think about goal setting, it's like a team sport. Think about field hockey, ice hockey, korfball. If you just set targets that are only relevant for the individual, it might not be in association with other performers in the team. So by setting targets in association or agreed with targets for other players, we get the combined effect. Let's keep going. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. The targets must be realistic. So there's our R, we haven't looked at recorded here. By, there's our explaining how language. Challenging but not impossible, by being challenging but not impossible. Okay, how many have I got there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've actually got my max there already for my 6 marks. An example would be improving multi-stage fitness test score by 5%. So look, here's my example. Okay, so the question asked me for examples. We must give examples. Split time, an example. Fitness test score is an example. Continuous training, an example. Okay, let's move it on, even though we've got our marks. Finally, Kate's targets must be time phased, and I remind you, time bound or timed. Make sure you use the right language by setting a deadline for the target. Now, of course, you GCSE bods, you guys are going to go on to talk about exciting. We want the targets to be really compelling and motivating for the performer, and recorded. We want them to be written down, training diary, record keeping, that kind of thing. So you could keep going in that environment. But the key thing to me is, the key thing I'd like to draw out of that is I've clearly explained how, and I've clearly talked about SMART goals in relation to specific examples. Again, remind you, the specific examples are things like, I'm going to use continuous training. We're going to look at fitness test scores or performance indicators. Maybe I could, sorry, I should have said split times. There's my example. we've got here challenging but not impossible. 5% improvement over 6 weeks. It's an example. And deadlines, probably I should have given another example here at the end, in truth. Okay, so the deadline, the training improvement must be achieved by the 7th day of the 6th week, for example, in the example I gave above. So, guys, what I would say to you is, I'm sure you'll have been given a lot of guidance by your teacher over the 2 years or even 3 years you've been studying this course. That's great, okay? But some of this stuff is just common sense. Some of this stuff, if you're asked to give examples, give examples. If you're asked to explain how, you should be using language like through and by. If you're asked to do that in the context of SMART targets, you should literally write exactly everything you know about SMART targets within that framework and that structure. So in many ways, this isn't rocket science. You need really good knowledge. You need to understand what the command terms are and what they mean. Goodness sake, have a look at our roadmap service. It's magnificent for achieving that. And beyond that, you get all your knowledge down onto that page. Now, if your teacher has been saying to you, we'd like you to use a P method or an idea method, I suppose you should. Okay, I suppose if that's what you've been working on over the course of 2 years and you've become really, really good at it, then by all means do that. And it's probably going to be very functional for you. But also don't neglect how straightforward sometimes these structures can be. Sometimes you just need to look at what the questions are asking you to understand the structure of that question, and then within that response format, get all of your knowledge on the page. And that's what I feel I did in this particular answer.
So,
good.
That's that. That's that. 5 bits down. So, any questions for me or anything else?
I do have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Why this SMART acronym? Why does it stand for different things depending on the exam board?
Good question.
Thank you.
I'm sure us PE teachers out there would all like to also have the answer to that question. I don't know. Yeah, so the way we do that is obviously in a scenario like this, when we've got people with different exam boards with us, we'll cover all possibilities. Just so that you know, if you use the EverLearner.com, it is exactly that little image I put, that little rectangular image I put there on the screen. That's exactly what we teach you, and teach that only. So if you're doing agreed, not achievable, if you're doing realistic, not recorded, or any combination thereof, then we cover that in exactly that detail for you on the EverLearner.com. So you should have a look at that. In terms of why, I'll give you another answer. In my opinion, what it should be, and I'm only speaking to teachers here, students, do the one that your exam board asks you to. But for me, the key thing is that the A should be agreed, because I don't think you can have achievable and realistic in the same acronym. It effectively means the same thing. So it should be agreed. So it should be specific, measurable, agreed, recorded, time phased. Realistic, time phased. And for me, I like the ER bit, the GCSE do as well, the excited and the recorded, and that gives you a fuller picture of what a goal would be. So yeah.
Brilliant. And I've got a question from Mike as well. It says, should you link SMART to the same example all the way through the answer when you are doing an exam, or use a different example each time?
I think that a lot of that depends on the question. So you could in the answer I just gave, you could certainly start with one single beautifully written, compelling, smart or smarter goal, and then base everything in that. I don't think that would be any problem at all, because then that's going to mean that you're going to pull out different elements of that as you go through the different letters of the acronym. But what I think is more natural to do is you build it up through your S and your M and your A and so on, and you build it up that way. Whether you use more than one goal, I don't think it really matters at this point. If you can come up with numerous different examples of goals. I mean, what was I saying there? I was talking about 5% improvement over 6 weeks of a multi-stage fitness test score for a triathlete. Okay, now would that, for you GCSE guys, would that achieve the exciting aspect? I'd probably have to build in something additional there. We could also stay within the goal that it's agreed between the coach and the trainer and the athlete, for example. So yeah, but by all means use more than one example of a goal. But if you only have one, there's you can use it at different moments within the answer.
Okay.
All right.
Yes, that's for now. That's it for questions. But we've got. Oh, actually, no, we do have another one.
Oh.
We've got one more picture sent from the PE department at. Hold on, I've forgotten the school.
Farnham Heath.
Farnham Heath. Yes. And yeah, they're doing Jenga, revision Jenga, which looks fantastic.
Good game.
Yeah, students really engaged.
Yeah,
fantastic, amazing.
Very good. And Farnham Heath End, you guys are just down the road from us. In fact, I could almost throw a stone to Farnham Heath End School here, although I'd probably get into trouble if I did so. So you guys are literally down the road from us. So I think, as I spoke to one colleague at the school recently, the offer is there to ever do some work together if you guys are interested. So yeah, get in touch. That's great to see.
Yeah,
good
fantastic.
stuff. A bit Jenga or Jenga? I don't think anyone ever knows.
Oh, I've always called it Jenga.
Not Jenga.
No, but I don't know.
It's up to you.
Yeah.
It's up to you. Okay, anything else?
Yes, we've got a little bit. We've got Yazis, I suppose, saying that she loves your voice, James.
Is it a he or is Yazis a he or she?
She probably.
She's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I do as well. I've worked hard on this voice. 41 years it's taken me. You should have heard me speak when I was a 15-year-old. I was an idiot. And I did not have a very good vocabulary. And I had a thick Cumbrian accent, believe it or not. I had a very, very strong northwestern accent. And most of the time people didn't understand me very well. Since living where I live now, I've had to neutralise my voice a little bit so people understand me better, not least to make these videos. So, yeah.
And then we've also got a question from Tommy. Tommy is saying, what did you have for dinner last night and how did it affect your balanced diet? Which doesn't really quite relate to the SMART targets, but, it's quite an interesting question.
Well, I should give a very rapid answer to that. I took my family out for dinner last night and we went to a newly opened local Indian restaurant, actually Nepalese restaurant. We have a very strong Nepalese community where we live here in North Hampshire because Aldershot is near here, the old military garrison, so a lot of the Gurkha community is based where we live, including our next door neighbours. We went to a Nepalese restaurant last night. It was fantastic, really enjoyed it. And how does it contribute to a balanced diet? Well, I would say I probably overdosed somewhat on vitamins and minerals. I had a lot of spices, a lot of vegetables in there. Some good protein, some good amino acid from some lean meat, from some chicken, and
probably carbohydrate were high as well with the rice, the naan bread.
Rice, naan bread, quite high in the carbohydrate, quite high on the simple carbohydrates. Yeah, quite a lot of refined. Yeah, kind of a lot of refined carbohydrates. Yeah, that's true. So a lot of white flour, white rice, that kind of thing. So faster acting carbohydrates. So. Yeah, so that was dinner last night. That's not that typical. We don't normally do that on a Wednesday. It's normally a Tuesday because it's a banquet night at our local Indian restaurant. But we went to a different one last night.
Which is also Nepalese.
It's also Nepalese. It's also Nepalese, that's true. So yeah, that's that.
Right.
Okay.
That's it, really.
Well, thank you for the questions. Really appreciate it. You sure you just haven't had one come through Skype, Marta, possibly?
Possibly. Hold on.
Hang on. Oh, no, you haven't.
No.
No? Okay, fine. Well, in that case, we shall wish you a very good evening. We have got our 6th show for the GCSE, which is on, let me get this right, on Monday when we do the sports psychology. I'm trying to remember the topics off the top of my head, but you've got them in your notes already, but I believe it's mental preparation and feedback, if I remember correctly. So you guys can obviously join us for that. And can I just let you know as well that during that show, we're going to be making an announcement of what our provision is going to be in the day before each exam, okay? So, well, assuming you're doing a paper 1 and a paper 2, not everybody does. But we're going to be putting in some day before last minute revision as well for people, and we'll be making that announcement on Monday, so be part of the show there, and we really appreciate your involvement. I'm all done, I think. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We genuinely appreciate it. Otherwise, I shall wish you a good evening and the very best as always. Take care and thanks for being here.
The traditional classroom environment doesn't suit everyone. Students that don't fit this pace of learning begin to lose confidence. The problem is, the current learning model has holes in it. Luckily, the EverLearner.com is here to fill those holes. With the EverLearner Classroom, each student is given a chance to master each subject at their own pace. With thousands of video tutorials and tens of thousands of automated questions on the site, students can progress at their own individual pace. And because every interaction is tracked within the site, teachers can review students' progress and gain access to razor-sharp data. Teachers will have more time to engage with small groups and be better informed of where their time and support is needed. With the EverLearner, teachers can leave the traditional model behind and become facilitators, coaches, and inspirers. There's a reason we have over 100,000 registered students. To learn more, visit our website today.
make you see, make you see. I have realized.